you now. Honey, gone away, out of sight, as they say. Nobody needs you when you are gone. Love only know you when the dollar around. When you are rich, you do what you want to do. When you fall, I don't better than you. That's why I want more money, plenty
to Drive Time Exchange. As rubber hits the road, hard talk meets great music. Monday to Thursday, 4 to 6 p.m. on the Net Radio, taking you above and beyond.
It is a New Era TT Radio, taking you above and beyond, as this is just heard. I want to say good day to everybody. Good to have you here. And of course, this is the Drive Time Exchange. And this is where we are joined by journalist extraordinaire, Mr. Tony Fraser. Tony, good day to you.
Hi, Charles. You're hearing me?
Yeah, I'm hearing you pretty well.
Okay, wonderful. How are things this afternoon?
Yeah, things are pretty good, man. You know, I got a nice weather today. You know, the rain didn't stop, didn't come down. You know, so it was good.
Good. Sounds good.
Yeah, give us a little opportunity to dry out.
I saw some pictures on television last night. Quite a bit of flooding in different kinds of areas.
It was. It really was. You know, so I know those people will be glad for the little sunshine today.
Well, the fact is that, this thing has been going on since Lord knows when. And succeeding governments have not been able to solve the problems. In fact, they come in and they blame the previous government, and the story goes on and on.
On and on.
And on. Yeah, you're right. Okay, we have a different kind of story this afternoon. And we want to look at the energy sector. It's wide knowledge that the dragon has fallen through, and which was being depended upon as a major element for economic sustenance. We're not talking about recovery or development. We're talking about sustenance over the next period of time. And that has gone through because of President Trump's own battle with Venezuela and Maduro and so on. So that has put a serious dent in their aspirations of Trinidad and Tobago. So that is at the side. But there has been talk about a number of other possibilities, and we want to explore that this afternoon with two energy experts. I see one is here, Tony Paul. Are you there, Tony?
I am here, Tony. Thanks for having me.
All right, Tony and Tony. And we expect Gregory Maguire will join at some point in time to fill out the discussion, different views on what is happening. So, Tony Paul, you've heard my introduction and what I said to you in terms of inviting you. And the real, question is, are there options in terms of energy possibilities, perhaps not as great as the dragon would have been, but nevertheless, there are alternative options. And Trump is the kind of president that we don't know what he will do next. So that cannot be depended on. So here you go, Tony.
Thanks, Tony. So I think, Tony, from the discussions I've been hearing around, there are two aspects of this question as to what else is there. How much more can we get from this? And one of them is, where else do we get oil or gas to find additional production and, of course, revenue? But the other one, more interestingly to me, is how do we get more revenue from what we already have without changing laws and contracts and just implementing that what we have in place? So let me start with the first one. Of course, Dragon was very, very important for many reasons. One, it's close to infrastructure, gas, very high volumes. Not only that, it's very rich gas, meaning that gas has a lot of liquid components, which will mean that the products coming out of Phoenix Park will be much richer in terms of LPG and so on. Now, the gas in Trinidad is being produced.
Sorry, Tony, before you go on, explain that a little bit more to our listeners, the richness of the gas. How can Trinidad and Tobago, any country, benefit from processing that gas?
Thanks, Tony. I'm sorry for that. That's a good catch. Now, oil and gas, as we may know, are made from the same molecules in the ground by the same processes where organic matter, mostly microscopic plant material, dies and is buried on the seafloor and as it gets buried deeper and deeper over millions of years, temperatures rise, pressure rises, and they get cooked, is the term we use. So these plant matter then change their form, and they change into what we call hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are a family of chemicals that are made up entirely of carbon and hydrogen atoms in the molecules. The simplest form has one carbon and four hydrogens, and that is methane. Methane is the most common component of natural gas. As you get more and more carbon atoms in a molecule, you get heavier molecules, of course, and eventually the heavier molecules become liquid at room temperature and pressure. The lighter ones are gaseous. So methanol is the first, methane is the first, then ethane, and so on. When oil and gas are produced in the earth, sometimes you get more oil, sometimes you get more gas. Many times you get a mixture of them. And when the gas is produced, it comes up not only as methane, but also the heavier gases like butane and propane and ethane and so on. Propane and butane are what we use as cooking gas. Or cooking gas is mostly propane. Butane is something you use in lighter fuel, for instance. So they're rich fuels. So when you get a natural gas, a gas with more liquids or more higher components that can be liquids at room temperature or pressure, then those are more valuable. Natural gas is mostly used for heating, and it's sold as a function of the amount of heat every 1,000 cubic feet holds. So it's measured in million British thermal units. So the more of the richer, heavier molecules you have in that natural gas mix, the more valuable it is. So when we produce gas that is rich in liquids, Phoenix Park plant extracts those liquids and then sells them as LPG or as propane. So that's how it works, Tony. So over time, what the companies have done, and rightly so, is produce the richest gas first. And Phoenix Park made a lot of money. But now, of course, the gas that remains in Trinidad is mostly what we call lean gas, meaning very little ethane, butane, propane, and so on. So that methane is very valuable for converting to petrochemicals and for liquefied natural gas, but we don't get the richer component. It means that our gas fields that are rich in these liquids have mostly been depleted, at least the big ones, and now the Venezuelan gas fields still have a lot of these rich liquids. So that is one factor that makes them valuable to Trinidad. It will mean that Phoenix Park, which is a state-owned company, and privately owned by locals as well, will be much more profitable, and we get more gas for exports like LPG and so on.
So the bottom line is getting the gas from Venezuela has or had greater possibilities than ordinarily that we would have got gas, yes?
Yes, than the gas we are producing now. Now, keep in mind, and I'll come back to this later, that we do have other gas that we're not exploiting at the moment that may be that rich. And I'll come back to that in the second component of where we can get more gas in Trinidad. And then we come back to where you can get more oil in Trinidad. So in Venezuela, the Dragon field is one of a complex of multiple fields. Dragon itself has between 3 and 4 trillion cubic feet. And for context, when Atlantic Train 1 was built, it was built to produce 450 million cubic feet per day, and that would last it for 15 to 20 years. That's 3 trillion cubic feet. So that's context. It's a lot of gas. Now, the rest of the fields in that complex near the Dragon have about 13 or 14 trillion cubic feet altogether. Each of these fields, like I said, has very rich gas, a lot of high value other natural gas products. They're natural gas when they come to the surface, but easily converted to liquids. They're gaseous rather, but easily converted to liquids by either cooling it or compressing it and pressurizing it. And that's why the propane you use in your house is in a tank. It's under pressure. It's a liquid air. And once you release the pressure by opening the valve, it turns to natural gas, the gaseous rather. Yeah? So we say liquids because although they may be gaseous when they come to the surface, they easily convert into liquids, which make it easier to store and transport.
All right.
Sorry to confuse a little bit there.
No, that's fine. We want a little bit of explanation to the national population who probably don't get sufficient information, pure information. Often it is tied up in political drama and all of that. So it's good that this kind of information is going forward. All right, so we come back to the basic question now of the dragon has been slaughtered for the time being. We don't know if he or she will survive the situation. What are the other possibilities that are left which can be explored to produce some life sustenance for the country over the next few years?
Sure. But before I get to some of the others, let me just continue with the Venezuelan story, because dragon and the fields adjacent to it are massive, but they're also huge potential, some of it already discovered, all along the Gulf of Paria on the Venezuelan side of the border, and on the Columbus Channel, south of Trinidad on the Venezuelan side, and going to the Atlantic. Now, so far, all we've discussed, other than dragon, are those fields that straddle the border between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. Now, what dragon would have done, would have opened up for the very first time in Venezuela's history the option of moving natural gas from a field to a foreign sovereign state to be processed and monetized. Putting the mechanisms in place for that, the legal and contractual arrangements in place for that, would have opened up all those other fields to become commercially viable. And that is a really big future potential for TNT. And that is why this Dragon deal was so important. The Dragon project by itself was not, in my view, optimized to get the best out of it, but it would have opened up the door for a much bigger potential for Trinidad and Tobago's natural gas industry to continue to grow and to prosper for a long time. So that's on the Venezuelan side. On the Trinidad side, we would have seen recently that there were announcements by BP that they were just starting to produce some smaller fields. Well, the truth is, BP has in its portfolio a lot of these smaller field potential that, given BP's global portfolio, those didn't match the investment profile, and they were left to be just stranded in a sense. Now, it's a shame because under its contract, BP is supposed to optimize the production and the development of the resources in the area it holds. And the ministry has the responsibility to make sure that is done in the best interest of the country. Now, just by background, as you may know or not know, Tony, I'm a geologist, and my work has been in exploration geology and geophysics and leading that kind of work. And in basins like ours, in mature basins, is a concept sometimes referred to as the creaming curve. And essentially what's been proven from time to time, from place to place, is that typically the big oil and gas fields are the ones that are first discovered and produced. And it makes sense to go after the big ones in a new place. And most often, like in Trinidad's case for natural gas, to produce our gas, we have to convert it. We couldn't use it ourselves. So we had to use plants like liquefied natural gas, ammonia, methanol, iron and steel power. And that required big investments, big infrastructure, big pipelines, big volumes. And therefore, they needed big fields. So there's a huge, to start a new basin, scale was very important. Now, plants needed guarantees of long-term gas supply to be able to get financed. Otherwise, they would make money for enough money to pay back their loans. Now, once those plants are in place, once the pipelines are in place, once the capital costs are repaid, then they can sign contracts for 1 year, for 15 months with smaller fields. So they don't need 3 trillion cubic feet. They could use 200 billion, 0.2 of a trillion, or 100 billion. So smaller fields can get developed. They can feed into the existing infrastructure. They don't have to pay for the big pipelines. And therefore, they can become commercially viable. And in basins like ours, in mature basins, history has shown that the amount of oil or gas in the large fields is equal to the amount of oil and gas in the many, many small fields. That said, it means since Trinidad has only been producing large fields generally, we likely have as much gas remaining in small fields that have been underexploited because it's been held in acreage controlled by BP, whose global portfolio didn't match investing in those. Other small companies in Trinidad, like EOG, like others, will give an arm and leg for those small fields, but they don't have access to it.
Yes.
So the
So the
ministry's
critical
role is,
question here for our listeners and viewers to understand is that there are several other fields, small fields, which are under the control of BP, but they are not economical for BP to exploit at this point in time. Is that what you're saying?
I did not say that's economical. I said it's not in BP's portfolio interest to develop.
Okay.
Now, before gas becomes a field, it has to be proven. It must be drilled. As an exploration manager, I have hurdles which will give me the right to spend the company's money. And one of those hurdles is that it must be a certain size or have certain value. So if I have assets in multiple countries, I will only go after the big ones. It doesn't mean the small ones aren't profitable. It means they're not as profitable as the big ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So it's not that not economic, it's how it matches the operator's global portfolio. The question we have to ask ourselves is who is managing Trinidad and Tobago's portfolio and making sure we get the best out of what we have.
Okay. All right. So Gregory Maguire has joined us. I see his picture there on the screen. Gregory, afternoon to you.
Pleasant good afternoon to you, Tony. Pleasant good Hey, Tony and Tony, just realized.
Tony.
Yeah.
I agree.
Tony and Tony up to mischief.
There's another frequency that has John and John, you know, so and they have a particular reputation, so be careful, guys.
All right. So Gregory, as indicated, the essential question that I have is that now that the dragon has gone away, I don't want to say the dragon is dead and slewed and so on. We don't know what is going to happen in Trump's mind at some point in time, or indeed whoever succeeds Trump, notwithstanding the fact that he's threatening a third term. Well, as the American business, we can't be involved in that. The question is, are there other possibilities for the country to look forward to in, I don't know, the short and medium term, given the country's need for this energy from which we earn foreign exchange? Yes, Gregory, you're hearing me?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks much, Tony. And Tony Paul is sitting here. So you know, a question about where resources lie are best handled by the geophysicists, geologists among us. But nonetheless, I think that the short-term options are very well defined and are there and are under development, under exploration in various forms. I think that during the election campaign, I may have been one of those people who early o'clock had posted the exploration map and identified a number of prospects that were going to come on stream between now 2025 and 2027. And indeed, when we hear the announcement a few days ago about Perenco and Onyx, that was one of the fields that was identified. BP SIP. I don't have all the names at my fingertips right now. But there are a number of fields there in the southwest that have been identified and that are under development, under exploration of one form or the other, which where there is proven gas and And in the short term, they would serve primarily, I think, to keep the production levels in and around 2.5 to 2.8 BCF, depending on the volume and the flow. And over the medium term, it's always, when I say 5 years beyond, it's always, hello?
Yeah, we're hearing you. Go ahead, Gregory. We're
All
hearing
right.
you loud and clear.
The screen is jumping all over the place right now.
It's fine. It's fine.
Over the medium term, I think that there's some other prospects in Trinidad, deeper horizons and so on. The Calypso field is one that has been identified there north of Tobago. And there is gas to be found 5-10 years away from here. Today there might be new finds and so on. So I think my answer to your question is there are options within our jurisdiction, and I'm not sure if this is what Tony was saying when I came in, because I came in late. But there's always the business of smaller fields that the big multinationals may not have been attracted to them. So, for example, when I hear that Woodside is selling some of its assets to Perenco, I think it is, and some people believe that's a negative thing, I think that might be a good thing, because Perenco is known for taking these smaller fields and fields that other people don't want and turning it around, finding the gas, finding the oil, and doing wonderful things with it on a profitable level, simply because their threshold of profitability is lower, their operating costs are lower, and they can do what big companies can't do. So I think that's a positive thing. So in short, I think that there are resources within our borders that would probably serve us well in terms of maintaining production, maintaining the supply at current demands, or a little bit above the current demands of about 2.5 to 2.8, maybe even up to 3 BCF a day. When we go beyond the next 10 years, that's when we see that if no new gas is found locally, that's where we see, I think, where the challenge really lies for Trinidad and Tobago, big time.
Okay, so the question I have for both of you, both Gregory and Tony, is we have to assume, and I am assuming, that if the government now, when it was out of office, wasn't fully aware of all of the possibilities, surely by now there would be an exchange of information to the government from the technocrats in the public service and so on. So everybody would be aware of the Minister of Energy and his company and so on would be aware of all that is possible, all that was said by Tony Paul and now Gregory Maguire. The question is it logical to expect from here that the government, the new government, will now develop what kind of programmatic approach that is needed to exploit these possibilities? Tony?
Thanks, Tony. No, that's what one would expect. One would expect that a new government coming in would relook at the landscape, get a feel for what's out there, what the risks are, what the opportunities are, and then come up with a strategy to say, this is what we want to get. This is what they're willing to give in return to get that. But to do that, the government must have a good read on the technical and commercial aspects of these ventures. And given what's happened in the past, it was just to me that has not been forthcoming, because these small fields Gregory alluded to didn't just appear overnight. We knew them to be there. What worries me, Tony and Gregory, is that we're not really focusing on getting revenue from these fields, and certainly not collecting the revenue that's due to us under the existing law and contracts. So we've known about the tax avoidance issue, which between 2010 and 2016 is 5 years of 30 or 16 billion US dollars in revenue. That gap has not been fixed. We know, for instance, and Gary mentioned that Woodside and BP are selling fields to Perenco. Most people don't know that everything that went into those fields, the exploration costs, the drilling costs, the fabrication of the platforms and pipelines, was paid for by Trinidad and Tobago through the sale of our oil that was then used to pay back the money spent. And when those fields were sold, they were sold at a profit to BP or Woodside. But that revenue is not taxed because the oil and gas contracts under which they operate only tax revenue from the sale of oil and gas. So the capital asset sales, even though we paid for it, they sell it and pay no taxes on it. So there are a series of places like this, Tony and Gregory, where we're not diligent about collecting the revenue that is due to us under existing law, or potentially due to us if we plug gaps in the existing law. And that to me is the biggest worry, because every year we hemorrhage billions of dollars in what could be foreign exchange by lack of diligence in implementing the existing laws and contract. So even though you get new production, and we're not going to get the revenue that's due to us, so numbers will go up in production or maintain in production, but we're not getting the benefits we see. And I won't even start to talk about the benefits due if we were to use a domestic supply chain. That is a huge conversation, and the revenue potential there is even more significant in my view than what we're getting from taxes and oil and gas. And I can explain that if you would like me to at some point.
Yes. Just to clarify, from memory, it seems that some years ago, I don't know how long, 10 years, 15 years, or 5 years, that BP had some fields that it farmed out, contracted out, some small fields, the small fields that we've been talking about, to some small operators. Am I correct in that memory?
So BP has farmed out the Perenco in the past, and those are the ones who's bought the recent ones. But in the past, Petrotrin, it's before had done that on land to some of its operations fields. Mm-hmm. But the farming out is a conventional way of doing business. Shell recently farmed out some of the land field to so that happens all the time. But in most jurisdictions, other than Trinidad, there's capital gains tax. We have none. So we pay for the assets through cost recovery. Somebody else sells it and takes away the profit without paying a dime in taxes.
Right. So what I'm trying to get at is that if these fields are not profitable for the big corporations to get involved in them, there must be a possibility for some kind of arrangement for the smaller operators to go inside there and get the kind of gas and oil for additional revenue for the country. Is that correct, an expectation that can happen?
Oh yeah, and Gregory explained it. Is that Seerattan, that hierarchy of investors and operators that changes with the maturity and size of a field. So the big players or the deep pocket players come into the big fields and get financing for the big infrastructure costs and so on, and they get big production. Once the production declines, then the only cost, operating costs, which are smaller, but the profitability reduces. And as Gregory said, big companies have bigger overheads. So smaller companies tend to have smaller overheads, which reduces their costs, and they can produce lower volumes and get production volumes and revenues that are material to their portfolio. The big companies, it doesn't. So there's a Seerattan where things migrate down to smaller businesses. In Trinidad and Tobago in the 1980s, when the oil price collapsed, and Petrotrin couldn't manage its own fields, we created a network of small lease operators and farm oil operators. And they took over the small fields and the small wells that Petrotrin didn't find commercial. So it's a natural stream of business, and we expect that, and the laws allow for that. What the law has missed is the fact that these things are being sold and profit is being made based on revenues expenditure paid for by taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago, but you don't get the benefit or the profits from the sales.
Okay, Gregory?
Yeah, I think I want to re-emphasize the point that Tony is making. I don't want it to be missed that perhaps the situation that we face here now, the biggest opportunity we have is not so much in new production, but the more immediately is in greater efficiency in tax collection and collecting the taxes and so on that are due to us. I have not heard this conversation within the political arena at all. In fact, what you hear in the political arena all the time is that the companies need new incentives in order to go and explore. And that the reason why we don't have any gas is because the incentive package wasn't good and they need incentives to go out in the deep waters, and deep water gas is too expensive and so on. So that's a narrative out there. And there's no conversation.
Gregory, who's pushing that narrative?
What narrative? About the big...
Yes.
Big companies need incentive. I think it comes from both political parties. You know, when the UNC was in opposition, their criticism of the PNM was that the PNM did not provide the necessary incentives to cause the companies to go and explore for more oil and gas. So if that's the mindset, then the chances are that they would miss that opportunity that Tony is talking about of actually examining quite carefully where are we losing value and trying to plug some of those gaps, because that can make a significant difference to the foreign exchange earnings that we have, you know. And all of this issue that we're having, all of these complaints we're having would not be on the table were not for the foreign exchange crisis. We are responding to a foreign exchange crisis, much more than a government revenue crisis. A foreign exchange crisis we're responding to.
Mm-hmm. No, I come back to the question I asked before we got into this part of the discussion, i.e. that if Gregory Maguire and Tony Paul know of all of these possibilities and they're not in the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Energy, the assumption must be that the technocrats, if not the politicians, the technocrats are aware of all of this information, and this information will be made available to the Minister of Energy and the government generally, so that there can be no question that a government in office, any government in office, can argue that, well, we don't know about all of these possibilities. Am I correct there?
Well, I think it's a safe assumption to make. I mean, the technocrats in the ministry in various ministries will do their jobs. I'm confident that they're going to do their jobs. One of the things I feel that we have to remember is that these hard technical things don't sell, eh? They don't sell. They don't resonate with the populace. So when a government takes office and they start to, so the government may get this information. That's not information that they would speak to in public, because that doesn't sell. That's not going to make headlines. That's not going to reach people.
Mm-hmm. But you know, Tony Paul and Gregory also, that the government, even before it got into the chair, the government of today, talked about Guyana and Grenada and Suriname and all of these possibilities which are outside of our grasp, meaning that we cannot control whether Guyana or Suriname or whether there is anything there in Grenada. And they were talking about all of that, and they haven't said, as far as I have heard, anything about what you fellas have been talking about this afternoon. Why is that?
So that's because they can get away with it. I mean, there's nothing concrete here, but just talk, and we like talking, right? The key issue in my mind, and I've been working in this industry, I can tell you, for a long, long time, the key reason we are suffering today is a lack of good governance in the sector. Now, you said that surely technocrats know these things, and they must be saying these things. And Gregory referred to it kind of saying, you know, you can tell them, but then they decide. The question is, what is the process by which decision makers make those decisions, and how do they account for the outcomes of those decisions. And our laws, as old as they are, our petroleum law in 1969, our Petroleum Act in 1974, they made very good provisions for accountability and transparency in the sector. But you know what happens, Tony? Consecutive ministers of energy and finance have been breaking the law, and nobody's holding them to account. And those are the reasons we get this kind of things falling away. And the technocrats have been marginalized or silenced. I give you example after example, but I'll choose one, right? Now I mentioned the tax avoidance and the money loss. And the 2015 Natural Gas Master Plan, often referred to as the Putin and Partners Report, and some subsequent work done by Putin and Partners for the PNM. They were first hired by the UNC, and then they revised their studies. And they reckoned that the revenue reported from LNG sales between the year 2010 and 2016 was $30 billion US, short of the actual revenue potentially collected, right? Now, that would give us, at a tax rate of 50% and 5% unemployment levy, it would give us over $16 billion US of revenue Trinidad and Tobago did not collect. Now, here's how that mechanism for collecting the right tax works, and here's what the reality is. Under the Petroleum Act of Tax Act 1974, the companies in Trinidad at the time, Tesoro, Amoco, Texaco, were selling product or crude to affiliated parties. In other words, their marketing arm, which is owned by the same parent company as them, were buying their product and reselling it on the global market. They were reporting prices to Trinidad and Tobago that was below the global market price, so that their profit in Trinidad would be reduced and they pay less taxes. The Petroleum Taxes Act put a mechanism in place to prevent that. And by that mechanism, the minister is compelled, he has to put in place something called a permanent petroleum pricing committee. Not that he may, he shall, right? That every cargo shipped out, a sample was taken, it was taken to the petroleum testing lab at Kariri in the university campus, it was tested, it was analyzed, that was given to this committee, the results, and they will then assess that crude against internationally traded prices. The company would pay the low price, pay tax based on the low price it got from its affiliate. Then when the minister got the report from the committee, he would write to the company, tell them this is the true value. A few months after, and they would pay the difference and reconcile. It was easy, right? That committee, Tony and Gregory, has not functioned since the year 2000 by my reckoning. Right? That committee was made up of the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Energy, head of what was of the Board of Inland Revenue, and head of what was then called the Audit Unit, in addition to other very senior technocrats. The fact that ministers, and the law says the ministers shall convene this committee, the fact that ministers have not done that for over 20 years tells you how lawless this industry is being run and why the company can get away with murder. But I'll give you one more example just so you know. When the Putin and Partners report came out, and the Prime Minister was so mad, he had a whole forum called Spotlight on Energy in March 2018.
That's right.
He said he would go after this money, right? And he went personally, right? And he came back with a check for 150 something million US, which works out about $1 billion TT. So this is a down payment from BP. This is exactly what happened under the UNC in 2010, when the Prime Minister came back from London with a check for whatever it was then, working to $1 billion TT dollars, which she said was a down payment. Both of them said it was a down payment. He doesn't get a cent more. The Prime Minister, when he went after Shell, got 2 billion TT. And he said, and this was so embarrassing, nobody picked this up. He said that he was embarrassed because when he went to Shell, Shell told him what they paid is in accordance with the contract. and therefore they have to live with that. He has an attorney general. He has all these lawyers around him. Everybody in Trinidad, including a geologist like me, said that no contracting can override the law. And taxes are fixed in law, not in contract. So here's where a case where the technocrats either are not advising the politicians because they're not allowed to, or even if they are, their advice isn't being taken. And it's very clear when we have negotiations going on, and the people negotiating are ministers and prime minister, and there's no technocrats, you know. So the problem is that the governance system, as set out in law, requires that technocrats do their work, that the way they do the work is covered by certain principles and procedures, and then the politicians have a role to play in approving or not. Right? The fact that the law itself put in place some systems for transparency, whereby we could follow this track. What's happened over time is they've shut down these systems and made it very opaque. So I was happy to see the incoming Minister of Energy say he will reveal the deals that were made. But I can bet you, Tony, so you asked Gregory the question, who is the one pushing this narrative? Right? There are forces who control the narrative in Trinidad that don't act in Trinidad's interests. And over time, I've seen them literally take over politicians and ministers. So if the minister follows through on his promise to reveal these deals, I'll be very surprised. The law allows him a mechanism to do it. If he's strong and willing to use that mechanism, I'll be the happiest person on the continent.
Right.
But the fact is the matter, the way I describe it, Tony, is that Trinidad behaves like a captive state.
Mm-hmm. Gregory, it's still puzzling and befuddling to my mind that here are possibilities that have been outlined by both you and Tony Paul about additional revenue not collected, etc., etc. And the whole business of politicians is to get revenue to run the country, and yet they are not pressing for these matters, ostensibly, that is.
Well, Tony, I know these days what you hear people say is give the new government some time. We are willing perhaps to give the new government some time. But I think what we need to look at now is what are the signals, what are the early signals? And the early signals are not one that focuses on revenue, on getting revenue, you know. So when the question is posed to the government about where will you get the revenues to meet the promised expenditures, all the promises that are going to be a drain on that are going to be a huge call on the Treasury. All we are told is that we will get it. We will. The revenue is there. We will find the revenue. So I have not seen so far a focus on the big revenue earners, which obviously it will be the oil and gas companies. You know, so it's difficult for me certainly sitting here to offer any insight at all into what will likely to happen. Most I could say is that having read a lot of elements of their manifesto and listened to the early signals, I'm not seeing that I'm not seeing that focus on the issues that we are speaking about.
In fact, was it the Prime Minister? It must have been the Prime Minister or one other minister talked about, when pressed on where the revenue is to come from, talked about state enterprises and selling off some of them. You know, we've had these sales of state enterprises over decades. And well, they must have cut the transfers to them somewhat, but we go back these financial agencies to the disbenefit of the country.
Yes, I mean, the things that they have said about winning new revenue are of making up the deficit are the standard things that have been practiced over the last decade. The last, I think it's only 1 year in the last 14 years that we've had a surplus budget, and that was 2021 or 22 when we had the war and therefore the high prices of petrochemicals as well as oil. So the pattern is the same, which is that you borrow in the domestic market, you try to borrow in the international market, you go to the state enterprises and see what you can sell. No, you go to the central bank first and you draw down the overdraft, and then you go to the state enterprises and see what you could sell. One of the significant things of the last this regime, and in fact, is that often spoken about drawdown on NGC surpluses, and that was a very large chunk of money. Estimates range from $12 to $16 billion that NGC had in surpluses. Now that's not available going forward. That's not available as ROMs. The company does not have any such surpluses and so on. So that's a major source of revenue that has been depleted.
What about the HSF?
Yeah, well, I mean that too is going to be depleted because the rules are such that I think it's about $4 or $5 billion now, and she promised to take out I think 1.5 or 1.7 or something of that order. And so next year, again, the rules of withdrawal are such that you have to have a fiscal shortfall that is 30%, 10% more than planned. In other words, if you plan for $100 in revenue and you got 95 or 94, then you can't go into the fund. But however, if you got 80, then you could go and take out, I think, up to 60% of the shortfall. You can make that up in the HSF. Subject, of course, to the HSF having a limit. You can't go below, the number in my head is $1 billion, which is very low, but I think that's the number in my head. So in other words, there's $1 billion that must stay there. So that even that is not unlimited. If you understand what I mean, it's not a fund that is there for all times. And deposits into the fund has not been what they should be. In fact, this is an important point I think we should make here right now. I have for years been saying that the rules of deposit into the HSF, as well as the rules of withdrawal, need to be adjusted. So the HSF, the governments are forced to deposit if the revenue earned from the petroleum industry is more than 10% of what is budgeted. Then the balance you must deposit. So what happens there, however, is that I think I have seen evidence where finance ministers have tricked the system by simply budgeting at a very high, unrealistic price of oil. So that way, the planned revenue is, say, $60 billion, but the price is wrong. And therefore, you will never earn that. And therefore, you will never have to deposit anything. My proposal for the Heritage and Stabilization Fund is this. If we're talking about heritage purposes, then a portion, $1, $2, $3, I don't know, 5%, 2%, whatever it is, of all the revenue earned needs to go into heritage for future generations. You understand what I'm saying? So that it is not subject to the minister arbitrarily picking an oil price. It is not subject to any of these things. It goes into the heritage whether it rains or whether prices rain or pour, whatever. So even if earnings are down to $3 billion, there's a formula that says that this 10%, 5%, 3% goes to heritage, so that that fund will continue to build up. And over time, hopefully, we could then perhaps use the interest from that, or part of the interest from that fund. But we've not done so.
Gregory, of course, you can explain to listeners the business of the heritage, the stabilization element of it, and the heritage element of it.
Yes, of course. So stabilization is about taking care of fluctuations in government revenue and expenditure, government revenue. So as we have now, planned revenue was I think $53 billion or something, and it has fallen significantly. So you now hear that there's a $11 billion deficit gap. So prices are volatile. The country's revenue streams are volatile because prices are volatile. And so the stabilization part of the fund was meant to capture situations in which prices fall suddenly and unexpectedly, as during COVID, and therefore you then use some of that money to supplement income in that current year. And that's stabilization. Heritage is really about putting money away for future generations, building up a stockpile of reserves that really is for the future. That's why, for example, now you will hear that, in fact, Norway talks about a pension fund. And I think Norway and Alberta might be. They speak about a pension fund, which tells you quite clearly that the message is that we're gonna build a stock of reserves here, and it's going to get to that point where the interest is going to pay the pensions of people, right? So, but we don't have that. We have commingled the funds, and we've called it heritage and stabilization, and we put a rules of withdrawal that allows you to draw down everything in it up to $1 billion. Now, that doesn't make any sense, because that whole fund could disappear except for the $1 million. Within the next 5 years, it can.
Tony Paul, of course, it depends, drawing down from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund or from the NGC or from wherever there are resources, the sale of state enterprises and so on. The critical question for me is, what do you do with it? You get all this money in your hand. Is it going to go into recurrent expenditure, or is it going to develop the capacity for greater earnings into the future?
Thanks, Tony, and I think you're right. I mean, there's two sides to the equation: what you collect and what you spend. But let me just add, I think you're giving a very, very valid point that we need to have better rules around this fund. And Gregory suggested a certain amount to be put into the fund regardless. But every single year, the minister changes the formula he uses to determine the price. 1 year we heard in the Funny Minister of Finance at the time, the government policy is we will use a 5-year rolling average for price to determine the next year's price. And that policy lasted for all of 1 year. The next year, the mechanism changed. And like Gregory said, it's clear to me they work backwards. They know how much they want to spend and then fix the oil price based on that. So it's a scam, really. So in terms of what we spend, of course, Gregory made a very good point about the Stabilization Act and the fact that Norwegians call it a pension fund. So I think there are three components of what goes into these funds. What you out the budget, what you use for savings, what you use for investments, and what you spend to carry the budget forward. And I think we need to, like Ghana did in their Petroleum Management Taxes Act, or the Revenue Act, they actually put in place a formula as to how this would spend, and they established an independent committee that would determine how this money would be spent and invested. In other words, which sectors had the priority in any given time based on a 5-year plan for development. There's some structure around that. We have none of that. Throughout globally, Vision 2020, 2030, whatever vision number they come up with, and then say in accordance with. But there's no real strategic approach as we had in the past, for a sustained development plan that these things go towards. And I think that's kind of what we need to start from. We need to start from the end. Where are we heading? How do we need to get there? And how do we spend to get there? And that's what's missing, Tony. But let me just go back a little bit, because, Gary made the point that we're nibbling at the edges of where to get revenue and leaving the big fish off the table. We're eating the crumbs. I mean, I'll give you some numbers, Tony, and Greg, and Gary heard me say this time and time again. If you look at BP's global numbers, and I pick BP because they're big here, between years 2011 and 2024, BP revenue was about $277 billion US a year. It's gone down recently, of course, because they've had a bad performance. Of that revenue, they've used over 80% to pay third-party contractors for goods and services they provide. Then they recover their own costs, and then they pay shareholders' dividends and government's taxes. Governments globally get 3% of taxes on all the revenue BP generates. BP's revenue comes 25% from upstream, exploration and production, and 72+% from downstream, refining, marketing, and trading. And trading is big business. Now, the Trinidad and Tobago legislation, Petroleum Act, makes provisions for the government to capture a fair share of taxes of that 80% of spend. And all it requires, it has required since 1969 and 71 when the regulations were passed, were for the minister to issue an order under the Act determining which companies are liable to be licensed to conduct oil and gas activities. Now, the law is very clear. Nobody should undertake petroleum operations without a license from the minister. And the laws and regulations are designed to manage licensees. Of the 20 plus petrochemical plants in Point Lisas, not a single one is licensed, not one. All the service contractors and agents are meant to be licensed. So the companies who are trading BP's LNG, who are shipping it, should be licensed and should be paying taxes in Trinidad. The most these companies might pay is 5% withholding tax, and the clever ones register a parent company in Barbados or St. Lucia and pay zero withholding tax. So 80% of this revenue is hardly taxed. But the local companies who are trying to get a piece of that 10% have to be taxed. So the government is letting slip a major part of the revenue from oil and gas that is not being taxed simply because the minister hasn't published an order which could be 4 or 5 lines and capture these companies. Because once you're licensed, you're bound to register a company in Trinidad, you're bound to pay taxes in Trinidad. You must keep books and records in Trinidad. And for decades, the governments have avoided capturing revenue from these companies who just rake money out of Trinidad. And no other country does this happen. But we seem to think that we're getting enough money from the tax we're collecting, so why bother with the rest? And if you think about the percentages, this is more than the government collects in taxes. They're just slipping out of the country.
I remember as you talk about that, I'm trying to remember his full name. Hamil, he was a public servant.
Hamil Ligol.
Hamil Ligol. Who spent the latter part of his life making all of these arguments that you fellas are articulating now, and it didn't seem that anybody took him on seriously. Anybody in the ministry, he wrote extensively. He talked. I remember working at AVM television. He would come there almost on a weekly basis. We would interview him. Perhaps we didn't understand fully what he was saying, but now a lot of what he said is becoming clear in terms of the ignorance of and by ignorance I mean lack of information or understanding of information about the whole oil and gas business. Is that correct?
Well, like best you call it innocence, Okay. But Gary knows that I said that there are 3 things that cause us to make these poor decisions: either innocence or fear, or greed, you know. And in Trinidad and Tobago, in a sense, since Hamel de Gaulle has been saying this, we can take, in a sense, off the table, you know, because it's not that governments and technocrats don't know these things. They know these things, and they choose not to make those decisions to act in the way the law prescribes they act. So it means that it either be fear or greed playing into the equation, or some combination thereof.
Gregory, want to come in on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I like what Tony said about this, in a sense, fear or greed. And I would say that there seems to be, I think our politicians and our government seem to be a little bit intimidated by the big companies, you know. While I was working in the sector, I remember being involved in some very big negotiations. And without calling anyone's name, but I do recall that, you know, there was one person, one negotiator on our side in particular, who was very strong in what he was doing, and you know, he stood his ground with respect to some particular clauses in the LNG agreements, and BP's head then was out relaxing in the afternoon, playing tennis, I think he was, right at the Hilton. And they sent out a call to him to come to the meeting. And the man came to the meeting with his tennis shorts on at about 5:30, and 1:30 the following morning, he was still there. But I say that to say that I mean, being involved in some of these negotiations, I got a sense that we are a little bit intimidated by the foreign multinationals. I think there's fear that they may leave the country. They may not do these investments that are so important to us. Like now, for example, given the crisis that we face, quite frankly, I can't see Trinidad and Tobago being in a strong bargaining position, or believing that they're in a strong bargaining position with these companies at all. So in all likelihood, they will come to the table and look for some very, very generous terms and conditions. And I'm afraid in such circumstances that perhaps our main recourse is exactly what we're saying here, that there are gaps in the act, there are things in the act that we've not been implementing, and therefore we need to say this is the law and we shall implement the law. Yeah, well, that would be my take on it.
I suppose if you are at the table and you're without breakfast and lunch the following day, you're susceptible to anything that they want to pass across you.
Yep, yes.
Okay, so we are talking here with Tony Paul and Gregory Maguire, two people who have been involved and continue to be involved in the energy industry and they have been there for a couple of decades. They still look fairly young, but they've been around for some time. And we're talking about the possibilities. We started off on the possibilities for the energy sector going forward. And where do we go from here, especially where do we earn the foreign exchange to acquire all of the things that we acquire? And as another element of the subject, how we spend the foreign exchange that is earned, not excuse me, not by the great earners, but rather by the great spenders. So we are talking about all of the possibilities in that regard. I want to deviate a little bit, gentlemen, to a big issue which is now under discussion, and that is what happens with Petrotrade. There's a lot of talk about reviving, going back to attempting to sell the refinery or keep it under perhaps the OWTU's request for taking charge of it, etc., etc. And we had the former energy minister expansively writing about all of the possibilities. Now, gentlemen, what do you make of it? Is that an option, meaning going back to the refinery? Is that an option that we can take? Is going to sell the refinery to a local arrangement, including the OWT? Is that an option? The previous government had made some preliminary, I suppose, arrangements with a foreign company. I think it was a Nigerian company. What are the possibilities ahead of us? Or is it that Petrotrin is something that we can ignore and leave? How long it has been in mothballs, so to speak, 6, 7, 8 years? I'm not too sure. Can we just continue to ignore it, or going back to it, is that an option? Let me hear Tony first.
So, just to be clear, Tony, Petrochem is more than a refinery. And although we've been hearing good news about the profitability of Heritage and Paria,
Right.
we still, I'm still not convinced that Heritage is a going concern, because I haven't seen them adding activity, adding reserves, adding production, adding revenue, a lot of profits coming out of the books. So I'm still concerned about their viability, and knowing the geology and the remaining potential on land, I'm not convinced they're doing all that needs to be done to get more oil out of the ground on land and the Gulf of Paria. You spoke about the existing potential for gas. I think there's a lot of potential for oil still on land, onshore on the East Coast, but I don't think we're going after that. But that's a different story. But now to the refinery aspect of it. There are several aspects to that. One, the operability, safe operability of the refinery. Two, the profitability of the refinery. And three, the strategic importance of a refinery. Right? Now, as you know, a strategic factor in any country's development is security of supply of food and power and energy. Right? The refinery gave us security of supply of fuel. Right? People argue, and I hear the minister kept harping late in the game, and I'll come back to that a key driver for choosing a partner for the refinery was one who had access to crude. Now, the Trinidad refineries were never built to only use Trinidad's crude. They were built to use Trinidad crude plus imported crudes. They were built in Trinidad because of its location and access to markets and the shipping routes that go close to Trinidad. And keep in mind, shipping routes between Trinidad and Tobago, the Galleon's Passage, is a major world shipping route. And remember that Trinidad and Tobago are south of the north of the Panama Canal. So it's interesting times there. So the refinery is a strategic asset for two reasons. One, it provides us with security of supply by crude being processed here and adding value to it, our own crude and potentially additional crude. But also, one of the reasons the Caribbean countries have been so impoverished and so heavily indebted is because of their small size. Because of the small size, they had a single operator of an import terminal. They couldn't have competition because one terminal would suffice their needs. And that terminal owner set the prices. And therefore, fuel prices in the Caribbean were very high. Because of the distance to production, you'd have to pay high transportation costs because they couldn't take, their terminals weren't designed to take large vessels, and therefore could only take small vessels with small cargoes, which meant the unit cost of transportation was higher. Trinidad, being closer, provided a cheaper alternative and a shorter distance. So Trinidad, by its location, could help the Caribbean countries' economy get away from some of the debt they had to incur from fuels. That was an important asset. Now, we could do the same thing with natural gas and LNG. We haven't done that, but we could, right? So strategically, it was important for both Trinidad and the Caribbean neighbors to have a refinery nearby. Now, there are other refineries in the region, but most of them have also shut down. So that was one thing. Operationally, from what I've seen and heard, and I've had the opportunity to visit the refinery and speak to the people maintaining it in the recent past, the refinery has been well maintained and getting prepared for reopening. So operationally, I think it's possible. It'll take some money and time to get it back up. And then viability is the commerciality. again, but across the world, refineries are difficult to make profits from, especially standalone refineries. So it's going to be a challenge, but it really means comes down to the trading part of it. Which crudes you buy, which crudes you store, which crudes you blend to get the right product at the right time. And a major factor of, I think, Petrotrin's failure, and this is my view, is that Petrotrin never maintained its tanks for storage. So Petrotrin could only buy crude to go straight into the refinery. They could not blend crude. So they couldn't buy cheap crudes and get the benefit of that. And that was a major issue. Petrotrin is also buying crude from the Urals in Russia and West Africa, and not Venezuela. So the whole trading aspect is an important piece. And the trading piece really depends a lot on the storage capacity. And Petrotrin's tanks have been underutilized. So there are tanks in Point 14 that are viable in terms of becoming brought back into use that are not being used. And we can build out that asset to make money just by having people rent it for storage, for instance. So the operability, I think, is there. The profitability requires better trading and management of the assets. So I think those can happen. I hope the government gets the right partners to develop this, because we do need that energy security. And I won't even go into the issue of the foreign exchange situation.
Let me ask you, Tony. Let me ask you, Tony, something that you raised, which has been raised in the media generally. You talked about maintenance of the plant, which has not been operable for some time. And we hear stories every now and again that the plant is in a very difficult condition and it will take X $1 billion to get it up and operating again. But you've said that some kind of maintenance is going on at the plant. Is that so?
Oh, yeah. So the condition the plant was put in is one to preserve it for startup. So, for instance, if you consider pipes with fluids, oil or gas or liquids in it, those pipes can become corroded over time. So what happened is those pipes were flushed out and they were filled with nitrogen. And nitrogen keeps flowing through those pipes to keep it from getting damage inside. Some of these big pumps and compressors have big ball bearings that these things turn around. If you leave them sitting down, those ball bearings can get warped. So from time to time, they will rotate them. So the force on the bearings is there all the time. So and then some pumps are turned on, compressors are turned on, generators are turned on, so they keep operating. So there's a maintenance program that costs $50 million a month to keep this plant in that state of readiness to start back up. That doesn't mean it doesn't have to be re-inspected and things fixed before you start.
Did I hear you correctly saying $60 million a month?
50.
50. Wow. How do we make that profitable, incurring that kind of cost and adding that kind of cost to whatever we do with it in terms of sale, in terms of whatever the arrangement? You have $50 million over a long period of time. That's a deficit you start with there, which might be difficult to make up.
Yep. So that's where I like to see accountants dig into the financial statements of the PPHL and its affiliate companies and really break that out. The Guaracara, which is the entity that owns the refinery, provides services to buy services from Paria and provide services to Paria. So there's some kind of revenue flow between them on paper. So Paria is the one who controls the storage tanks and the lab and so on. There's a whole series of activities that generate revenue between parties.
Okay. Gregory, your take on what to do with Petrotrin into the future. And let me be specific, the refinery element.
What to do with the refinery, yeah. What to do with the refinery. So there is no doubt in my mind as well that the refinery is a strategic asset for the reasons that Tony mentioned. And I too would like to see the refinery back up and running. You will recall that the government, the last government, at least on the face of it, offered the refinery to Patriotic, that is the OWTU people. And we never get the full story, or we don't know what the correct story is, but one story is that they couldn't raise the financing that they promised. They promised to pay, I think, $750 million to lease the refinery, and they couldn't raise the financing after some time and so on. So a couple of things I think we know is that restarting the refinery requires an investment, requires a significant investment of capital. So I hear the local businessmen and the OWTU and Patriotic saying that they would work on it. I wish them success, but I do know that it requires financing. It requires financing. It requires a partner or someone who has the experience, the capability, and the management skill to run the refinery and run it efficiently. So the old standard that we had with 2,500 plus employees and so on cannot be maintained, cannot be repeated in this situation. It has to be a completely different set of economics in terms of your manpower costs to run the refinery and to run it profitably. So there are challenges. The challenges of new capital, the challenges of how you configure your labor force, the challenges of finding crew, the challenges of your markets. The Caribbean market is still there. I think we will be competitive because of the transportation costs. We could still be competitive within the Caribbean market, and so some of those markets could be won again. Is that going to be significant enough? Certainly, when you're in situations like this, I think every drop adds to the bucket. So yes, winning the Caribbean market would make sense. But those are the challenges. Those challenges remain, and this is not. I don't think that this could happen overnight. I think it's going to take a while to find the partners and to find the money. So even if it's interesting that local businesses are now showing an interest in the sense of the central chamber, I thought it interesting that they're now showing an interest in it, because we didn't hear such interest from them or from local parties at all previous to this, except for Patriotic. But now it's interesting to see that the local business interests are expressing an interest in the refinery, and I hope that makes a difference. But I still believe that they will need foreign partner. They will need somebody who has the technical capability to really efficiently run an efficient refinery. They would still need to seal the markets or seal the trading arrangements that will get the product out and of Trinidad, and so yeah. So in short, it's worth pursuing. Indeed, you realize that the refinery has never been off the table. The last government never took it off the table completely. They always were, we need to find a partner. We need to find a partner. And this government is saying we will reopen the refinery, but they still have to find a partner to reopen it, because I don't think the state is going to go at this.
One of the criticisms of the shutting down of the refinery by the previous government one of them had to do with employment. So the people from San Fernando, Marabella, going down to as far as Scoover, perhaps, Claxton Bay, etc., people who benefited from employment in Petrotrin, the whole company, for decades. And therefore, an expectation would be that if the refinery is reopened under whatever circumstances and whichever company that was perhaps not with the same persons who were let go, but surely bringing back employment to the area. Is that a realistic expectation given the economies that will have to be exercised with the company? Both
Well,
Tony and Gregory. Yeah.
well, I think that there is an investment like this. Remember, there's direct employment and there's indirect employment. All right. So there's direct employment in terms of who the company hires to actually run the refinery and provide services in the refinery. There's the first order of indirect employment, which is service companies that are working for the refinery, and they are going to will have new labor. And then there is probably a third round of employment that arises because there's now a new body of workers, new economic activity around, and therefore more food will sell, more clothes will sell, more construction activity will take place, and so on. So there's several rounds of employment that comes out of it. So it's not necessarily the refinery alone. There's going to be that multiplier effect in the area. And you will see a pickup of economic activity in the area. I would want to caution people, though, that the glory days of Marbella, when we knew Marbella as a city that never sleeps, and you could pass in Marbella 11 o'clock in the night, 12 o'clock in the 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and there's activity going on because 300 men just come from shift and so on. These are not going to come back. So
that strip of land from the refinery gate back up to the junction.
Yeah. So people need to I think temper expectations of this because it's not going to happen. I mean, it's like Point Fortin, for example. I think perhaps when Trintoc was there, it certainly carried much more economic activity in Point Fortin than Atlantic. And Atlantic, in terms of the capital investments, is probably maybe 10 times the capital that was involved in Trintoc. And yet, the employment impact and economic impact on wider Point Fortin is probably less than it was during the days of Trintoc and Petrotrin.
Looney Paul.
Yeah, so Gregory speaks about very well about the economic impact and the multiplier effect when they go down to the guys selling roti on the street, the guys, people coming out to buy lunch from the refinery if they're working for the company or for a contractor. But one of the key parts we miss and another strategic asset interest in this refinery is we say to develop, countries must somehow industrialize. And to do that, you need STEM educated people, science, technology, engineering, math. But you have to have jobs for them. And if you close down the refinery, which was a major source, a major pool for people to get hired as young engineers, people working in the field, whether they are technicians, and getting that training and education and that skill on that, and then potentially moving out. And that's what we use to be able to quickly develop Point Lisas, and other industries. If you want to go to new industries or manufacturing, you need people with these kinds of experiences and skills. So that pool that can absorb people who are trained, where are all these young people who are getting degrees in engineering, who are going through the technical and vocational schools and getting diplomas? Where are they being employed? When Margaret Thatcher came into power, she saw the coal miners' union as a big enemy to her party and a strong supporter of the opposition Labour Party. And one of the first things she did was to shut down the coal mines. And that killed the Labour Party and the coal industry. And it killed many communities. There's a strong parallel in what happened when the refinery was shut down. And it was clear parts of that would have resulted in the union dying if it went that way. The union has not yet died, but who knows how strong it is. But in addition to that, as Gregory pointed out, you have communities who have died. And that seems to be a natural cycle of history of mankind. Things will die. but something must be put in place. And is it going to happen organically, or is somebody going to lead it to happen? When we shut down Petrotrin and the refinery, we're thinking of building other things that will use those engineers, those technicians, those people with vocational skills. China, people think China developed into a world power because of cheap labor. Well, even China is a strong manufacturing hub. It's not just about cheap labor, it's about good skills in technical and vocational services, whether it's electrical, plumbing, diesel, mechanic, molding, fabrication. And that's what made Trinidad and Tobago's economy so strong. We tend to think it's the engineers. No, it's the technicians from the trade schools in Texaco, in Caroni, in TNTech, from John Lee and Sando Tech and all those apprenticeship programs. If we don't have places for people to get practice and technicians need a place to practice, if we shut down plants and we don't get places for people to practice, where will we get those skills? How can we transform the economy into anything else? And let's talk about renewables and new businesses, which is a lot of hot air in my mind, right? Nobody's talking about where those skills are going to be used. And that to me is central to this discussion on the refinery. How are we treating our young people? How are we giving them experience? How are we building our technical and vocational class who are necessary for any kind of industrialization? That part of the conversation, Tony, has not been part of what we're hearing.
Now, if the refinery is brought back on stream under whichever ownership or management that is deemed to be the best option for the country, there may be an expectation which will go contrary to what the reality must surely be, that the gates of the company will swing open and people will walk in indiscriminately into jobs. Surely that will not happen, given all of the backlog of costs that have to be, catered for, and the operating of the refinery in a constructive and commercially viable manner.
It's not about the numbers only, it's about the quality of the jobs. Now, when the refinery opens, there will be the need to hire some of those people who were there before, who have the experience, who know the plant and the assets. And many of them will be older and approaching or past retirement. So there'll be need to bring in younger people to learn under them and learn alongside them and take it over. But not only the operations of the plant, but the plants have routine maintenance, change out of catalysts, some kind of works on an asset, and those usually are done by contractors. And those contractors are the ones who also hire technicians, and they bring people in, and they have engineers. So it's not just in the plant. Now, of course, the numbers of people employed will not be the same as we had in the past. We know that. But there needs to be some base load of people working in the plant and in support of the plant.
Gregory? Question of employment.
Yeah, well, I think Tony has made a very valid point about the refinery and these plants being a very valuable training ground for the technicians that we're producing. It didn't occur to me then, but that's a very, very valid point, because both TM Tech, Trintoc, or even before that, Texaco and FedChem, it was very much the norm for these companies to bring in trainees and to provide training opportunities for people. So it should be something that is on the agenda of the new owners of the refinery, or the new operators of the refinery, when that time comes. And I think they're going to have to make some choices around what will be the extent of involvement of the refinery in corporate social responsibility and these things, which was another pillar of the contribution made by Petrotrin to the communities, the grounds, the support for schools, the support for sporting facilities, and all of these things. And there are those who argue that that was one of the reasons why petroleum costs were so high, because they spent so much on social capital. The cost of the hospital, for example, and all these things that they provided to those communities. So there's no doubt that there's a gap there, and all these are considerations that should be placed on the table when we think about reopening refining.
Gentlemen, we are winding down to the end of the program, and we didn't get in anything at all about the trains that are outside there and the supply of gas to them, and what's going to happen in that respect. Are we going to meet those needs if we develop all of the small operations that we talk about that are viable at a certain kind of level?
The numbers that I have seen so far suggest that the fields that are earmarked to come on stream over the next 2-3 years will mainly contribute to what they call, I think the term is fill-in gas. In other words, they are going to keep the supply in and around 28 to 3,000 BCF, 2.8 to 3 BCF a day. And if that is the case, then that will simply keep the operations going now. There won't be much room for the restart of Train 1, for example. Neither would there be sufficient gas to accommodate any new plant and any new investments. As you know, we've not had any new petrochemical investments in this country since 2014. The last thing being CGCL, that's the Caribbean Gas Chemicals plant in La Brea. That was the last new plant that was opened in this country. So because investors know without a gas supply, it's pointless me looking to Trinidad to build any ammonia, methanol, or any other plants. And so the chances are there's a good chance that we could keep things running as they are, but expansion and full capacity is a little bit optimistic.
Lori Paul?
But I think we keep thinking the same way as we're thinking in the past. I mean, to start thinking differently. Like, we keep thinking there's a 4.1 billion demand for gas. In truth and in fact, Trade 1, as I understand it, is already being cannibalized. So you can take that 450 million cubic feet off the table. Some of the earlier ammonia plants are also too inefficient to be brought back on. So we need to ask a question for the minister. Realistically, how much capacity can we realistically bring back on? So what is the demand side? On the supply side, we need to have a plan as to what, and a visible plan as to what fields will come on when, how much production will they bring, what will that do with the current decline rate, what is our production profile like? So we talk about all these things that are out there on the map that people are talking about. But what's the numbers behind them? What's the cumulative effect? We're not talking about that. And that's just what we have. What we're not talking about is how to improve, get more from what we have. At the moment, all these old contracts have these export rights and the offtake rights that were rooted in the investment requirements of the new plants, which the lenders said, for me to invest in this plant, you must show me a credit-worthy off-taker and a long-term contract to pay me back. So all these plants, in spite of the promises to make steel available to the local market, for manufacturing, to make methanol available in the local market, you can't buy a barrel of methanol anywhere in Trinidad. Because all these guys have these contracts to sell it to their affiliated marketing arm outside of Trinidad. And therefore, there's no meaningful downstream manufacturing. And there's no meaningful downstream marketing because nobody can get guaranteed supply in Trinidad. Because Trinidad, unlike most developed countries or smart countries, has no domestic market obligation for producers. They're free to export. And when they sell to the local company, it's treated as if you bought it overseas and brought it back in at that price. There's no natural gas pricing mechanism in the domestic market in Trinidad. So we behave as takers, we behave as recipients of other people's goodwill, not as if we have any control in our destiny. We're not strategizing about the industry. We're not saying we're going to take methanol and use 10% to manufacture downstream. That'll be available at prices that are competitive, but not necessarily the same price. Who is the maker of the price? So to me, we just say, yes, we can build more plants. Yes, you can create more jobs, but we have to do it with what we have. And we haven't got gas, but we have product. Where's that product going? But we don't believe that we can say these contracts are all coming out, have been renewed or are being renewed. And we have a law on natural gas that was written in 1969. We never changed it. And there's so many gaps in that law. We have no natural gas regulation, none. Other than the generic ones that we have for pipelines and so on. So we have an industry that's the head of the economy that is very marginally regulated. And certainly not regulated from a strategic or fiscal perspective.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to put the last question to you. Really, it's more like a statement. Given all that both of you have said, both here and persons and officials outside of our narrow little radio program, what seems to me to be essential is a sense of a program of communication of all of these possibilities that you have talked about and more to the national population, so that people are not going off, or at least you curb the possibility of people going off on one side with one set of wrong information and expectations and so on. Is that likely to come from the government? Is it a mandate for the government to engage itself in as the country moves forward at this point in time?
If I jump in, I think what's encouraging is the minister saying on his very first day, I think, that he's going to make these views accessible to the public. I think what is key to a good conversation, Tony and Gregory, is access to good information. And that has been missing. We haven't got the information that people need to really analyze and bring suggestions of how to move this forward. So making data available, making information available, and then having those like Gregory and others who understand it, being able to stand up there and discuss it, and having others like you, Tony, who have the ability to reach a broader spectrum of people to translate this into language that people can understand how it impacts them. But one of the challenges I see in our discussions, our discourses, is that we speak at a certain level, but it doesn't reach those who impact policy making. These are the voters. Politicians only respond to voters and financiers.
Gregory?
Tony, Patrick Manning, I think it was in about 2008, 2009, in one of his speeches, made the point that we needed to depoliticize the energy sector. And I took that to mean that we needed to have open, honest dialogue with the population from time to time on this. We needed to engage the technical people who knew about the sector and use them rather than have them rebranded to be red or yellow, as the case might be, and push them aside to suit your party. And I mean, Manning never was able to do it. I don't think he intended to do it. I think it was just a good thought. But he didn't get anywhere with it because I don't think he worked out the mechanisms for how that could be done. But that is what I would like to see going forward. I would like to see open and honest dialogue around the sector. I would like to see a depoliticization of the energy sector. And for that, for me, means a focus on the tech people with the technical background, the societies that have the technicians in it. The Geological Society needs to have a voice, right? These things need to have a voice. When you look at some of the boards of the state enterprises, again, you see people and you ask yourself, well, who is this one? Where did this person come from? And so rather than put technical people, you end up with people who may have some knowledge, but they're more there because they are party affiliated than anything else. And both from a policy standpoint, as well as a company corporate standpoint, I think we need to move away from that, and we need to trust our technically sound people in this space. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, so Tony Paul and Gregory Maguire, thank you very much for enriching discussion about the energy sector, some of the possibilities, what has to be done almost immediately, like yesterday, in fact, for the country to move forward as, we have been for however long. The energy sector has been the main, sometimes only foreign exchange earner for the economy, and therefore this matters quite a lot to us. Of course, on the other side of another kind of discussion will be the argument about building out the other sectors of the economy so that everything is not fully dependent on the energy sector. So thanks very much for coming, lending your expertise, information, knowledge of the history of the organization and so on. And we are sure that our listeners are better off for it all. Thanks again for coming this afternoon. And Sir Charles.
Thank you much, Tony.
Thanks,
bye, guys.
And Sir Charles, is over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Tony. And thank you very much to your two guests for passing through. People, this has been the Drive Time Exchange on New Era TT Radio.